Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with reference recordings. And today we're talking about a special case. Some of you have been asking if there are any reference recordings that really weren't very good recordings. And I said, well, the answer is yes. And this is one of those cases. It's a reference that was a reference for reasons we'll get into, but it was very quickly eclipsed as a recording that just doesn't make that much difference, or didn't make that much difference for a number of reasons. So the work in question, I'm having a cat attack here. Hang on. Come here. Come here, Mildred. Look, we can play. Here she is. She wants to play. She always wants to play. And, all right, I'm going to put you down. We're going to play, okay? Come here. Go ahead. Go ahead. Get down. Here you go. You ready? Go. There. Now she's happy. Sorry about that. Let's start again. So, yes, the work in question is Mahler's Fourth Symphony. And the recording in question is Bruno Walters with the New York Philharmonic on Sony Classical with Desi Halban, soprano, from 1945. Which was transferred to LP rather quickly early in the LP era in mono, and to CD afterwards. So it was available and it was promoted because it had all of the right things going for it, right? You had Bruno Walter, who was the Mahler disciple, and in 1945 he was the Mahler disciple. I mean, there weren't really many other people doing Mahler, and at the time that this was recorded, it's a live recording, and it's not a very good performance. I mean, the orchestra gets lost at the first, at the development section climax in the first movement, and the sleigh bellist sort of goes haywire, and Desi Halban's not the greatest soprano in the finale. And, there are all kinds of little issues with it in terms of ensemble, and the sonics, of course, from 1945 aren't all that great. It was what there was. And there was a period, frankly, in the Mahler discography when we had to settle for all there was because no one else was doing it. And it was usually with Bruno Walter. There was that first Mahler 9, the first Das Lied von der Erde, the ones on EMI, and then this. But you couldn't get Mahler symphonies easily. There weren't many recordings of them. And because Walter had his pedigree, and of course, nobody could gainsay Walter in Mahler. It wasn't like there were a lot of other Mahler conductors conducting Mahler in order to compare him to, well, never mind, to make the comparison, he became de facto the reference recording. And when I was a kid and just first getting into Mahler and reading reviews of Mahler's Fourth Symphony, Walter was the reference. And people talked about it. People talked about it as well. There's Bruno Walter's performance. It has conceptually lovely things. It has a naturalness and flow that was typical of just about all of Walter's recordings of the Fourth. But then other things started to happen. First of all, there were other Mahler conductors. I mean, Bernstein's recording came out, which is fabulous. Kubelik's, which is fabulous. I mean, Karajan recorded it, which made a big deal around Karajan, people. It's not the best Mahler for it. It's not his best Mahler, but did it. I mean, he did it. There was that early Schulte one with Sylvia Stallman in the Concertgebouw, which was always really sort of mediocre also. You couldn't say it was better than Bruno Walter's. I mean, it was better recorded in some ways, but wasn't much. So, and Schulte was a nobody when he did it, so that didn't matter. So Walter held court for quite a few years. But then the Mahler boom happened. And remember, the Fourth Symphony was the one that everybody did who didn't normally do Mahler. So you had lots of very good singleton recordings of the Mahler Fourth. Modern recordings, too. I mean, there was the fabulous Previn Pittsburgh with Ellie Ameling, the Colin Davis with Bavarian Radio, really fine versions. And then things that came out in cycles and stuff. Just endless quantities of Mahler. And the Fourth Symphony was, primary among them. The early Concertgebouw recordings with Haitink and von Beinum, I think, did it. And I know everybody did it. So there were lots of Mahler fours. Never mind the cranky, strange Mengelberg, which everybody thought was insane anyway, and it was spottily available. So, that sort of sums up where we were with Mahler 4. And in that early company, that early group, Bruno Walter was the reference. And even though it had its problems, but now, looking back, it's hard to imagine that anybody could think that this is a great Mahler 4 with its, iffy sound and so-so playing and so-so singing, and even with Walter on the podium. There's just too much that goes wrong with it for it to be any kind of a reference for the work. It doesn't even give you the sonic splendor that is Mahler. Mahler needed stereo to have reference recordings in many respects because, Mahler without great sonics is not Mahler. He was the greatest symphonic orchestrator that ever lived, just about. And so if you can't hear what he's doing and hear it in true perspectives with good balances, and you're not hearing the work. It's not something that you can refer to. It's not a reference. So I just wanted to bring that up and talk about it a little bit because it's a very interesting case. And there are many such. In general, if we can reduce it to general principles, if there's only one major recording of a work by someone who had a unique affinity or authority in that repertoire, and it was done simply because circumstances weren't optimal, but it needed to be done, and it was the only show in town for most listeners because it was on a major label and you could get it. It was promoted accordingly. That would become the reference. And so it doesn't have to be a particularly fabulous recording of the work to become a reference if the stars aligned a certain way and these circumstances of performance dictated that it should be the one that people know about, even though it isn't ideal from anybody's perspective. And that's just the way it worked. And there are other examples of that, which we could talk about. I mentioned those other Mahler symphonies, which I will not discuss as reference recordings, because actually, even though you might have said, well, they could have been because there were no other choices, the idea that there is no other choice is something that I've sort of taken out of the equation for reference recording, because what happened with that Walter Mahler 4, of course, is that as soon as other ones started coming out, people sort of forgot about it. And by the way, there were other Walter recordings. There was his Salzburg Festival, Vienna Phil one or whatever. He did them in Vienna. He did them elsewhere. They weren't better, particularly, a little bit maybe here and there, but they were live and they were equally defective in various sonic and technical ways. But he started to compete with himself. Well, that didn't help him either in, determining one best recording that would be the reference. It did not. The Mahler 4 was a Bruno Walter calling card. He played it everywhere. So there you go. That's how a not so good recording of something can be a reference, at least for a time. But I generally have drawn the line for this series at stereo recordings, mostly. There are a couple monos and things, but stereo recordings, because we need to have something that people can say is characteristic of what the work ought to sound like, and it has to have a certain quality of sonics in order for that to be possible, and that's part of the equation that I've concocted. And it's a subjective bunch of criteria. But subject to those criteria, the choices are reasonable ones, I think. So there you have it, your question answered. Can there be a reference recording that's not necessarily a tremendously good performance? Yes. If the circumstances are right, there can be. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks for joining me. Take care.